The transpersonal models of Ken Wilber. So Ken Wilber, born in 1949, uh, there has been work to divide his scholarship into 5 phases, which he has approved of. And Wilber 1 is the Romantic Jungian phase, 1975 to 79. Wilber 2 is the lifespan evolution phase, 80 to 82. Wilber 3 is the lines of development, 83 to 87. Wilber 4 is the all quadrants, all levels model, or the Aqua model, 95 to 2001. And then Wilber 5 is 2001 to the present, which is what he calls his post-metaphysics. We'll be looking at what each one of these means, paying particular attention to the last couple of models, since they are the more developed ones. But I also want to spend some time with the early ones because there's actually a way in which some of his early models present some useful concepts that I think still have some validity. In Wilber 1, the Romantic Jungian phase, it's essentially it's a variation of perennial philosophy in a somewhat recognizable form. So perennial philosophy, of course, has a long history that goes back into the medieval period. But in the 20th century, the immediate precursor to Wilber's perennial philosophy was Theosophy and the Guénon-Schuon school of esoteric traditionalism. Now, the model that Fridtjof Schuon used is one that's been around for quite a while. I saw it many years ago for the first time in a Unitarian publication and had some real resonance for me. It was very helpful in terms of a way to organize my understanding of different traditions. So that model suggests that the so-called great traditions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam um, sort of have an exoteric or external aspect and an esoteric or hidden aspect, and that they all radiate from a common transcendent point, speaking metaphorically, so that in the hidden dimension, they are, at the ultimate point, they are the same, but it is really their differences are more in how they show up externally than they are in how they are in the hidden dimension. So perennial philosophy is a way to make sense of the fact that all traditions that there is there can be a real spiritual dimension, and yet various traditions can have different perspectives. Now, Wilber's version of this is a little bit different. Instead of having all of these traditions sort of coming from an ultimate, Wilber sort of flipped it around and he put the universal mind at the bottom of his chart and suggested that this universal mind went through progressive divisions into duality that came out of non-duality and went into duality through a consecutive process of splitting, so that you have this non-dual, this undifferentiated universal mind that then splits into organism and environment. So you have human beings and the world. Then it splits again within the organism into the ego and the body. And then finally the ego splits into the persona and the shadow. Now, one of the interesting things about this model is that it offers a way to suggest how various approaches to mental health to uh, uh, to psychotherapy can actually be relevant to various stages of this process. So if you have simple counseling, supportive therapy, it essentially supports the persona, not trying to heal any of these splits. It just accepts that the persona is in the world and tries to help it function better. Then ego psychology concerns itself with reuniting the persona with the shadow. That is, to restore the wholeness of the ego so that the shadow can be integrated and you can have a more whole person functioning in the world. Then you have somatic, gestalt, or humanistic therapies that are now working to reunite the ego with the body so that you have not just a more unified ego, but a more unified organism. And then finally, Jungian therapy, psychosynthesis, and mysticism, he suggested, are about reuniting the organism with the environment or with the cosmos. That's the sort of the mystical return journey where the organism seeks an experience of its unity with the world. So, um, this actually, uh, I find this a rather interesting little model as a way to organize different approaches to healing, to psychotherapy, so that there is some kind of model to suggest why these approaches are different and how uh, somebody might go about selecting what kind of work they need to do if they look at like where they are in this postulated process and seek out a type of therapy that will work at the level that they're looking for. Now it's called romantic Jungian in part because there's a model here where there is a departure from wholeness, a departure from Eden, a departure, if sort of like a paradise lost, where the non-dual goes through these successive splits and ends up in a sense of isolation from life. And then the spiritual path is one in which paradise is regained, where through successive integrations, there is again a reconnection with the universe. Now, if you look at sort of the structure of Wilber's model relative to the perennial philosophy, you can see that they have not exactly the same structure, but a similar metaphysical structure, if you will, and that is suggesting that there is a hidden dimension and that this hidden dimension is singular, unchanging, and that as the this source becomes manifest in the world, there is a dividing. There is a dividing into the variations that we see in the world, the diversity that we see in the world. So it's not exactly like, say, the Shuan Guanan school or the Theosophist school, but it is a variation of perennial philosophy. So that was Wilber's first attempt. And just to give you a little context, I want to remind you that transpersonal psychology was founded in 1968, 69, depending on what you consider the founding um, point. In 68, there was an article in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology announcing the formation of transpersonal psychology. In 69, of course, the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology started. So, and then in 1970, Abraham Maslow died. So you had this movement that was looking for a leader. And Ken Wilber was, in a way, chosen and cultivated to take on that role because his ideas were found very interesting by some of the leaders in the field at that time. And so, in um, that early idea of taking perennial philosophy and applying it to psychology seemed like possibly a promising way forward for transpersonal psychology. And so that early stage represents Wilber's first attempt. In Wilber 2, Wilber was looking more at the process of lifespan evolution. That is, if you look at Freudian psychology, the individual matures by the age of puberty, 12, 13, 14. That's kind of the end of the developmental process. If you look at Jean Piaget's cognitive model, it's by the time a person reaches 18 or 20, something like that, and has that level of rational discernment, that's maturity, and that's kind of the end of the road of development. And then you had Erik Erikson, of course, coming along with the lifespan development model, saying there were stages of development throughout the life. And Wilber sort of followed in that vein, suggesting, however, that it wasn't just sort of a biological development, but also a spiritual development that took over the span of the life. And on this, he suggested that the early phase of life was pre-personal, sort of like before the full development of the ego. Then there was the personal phase, which is sort of like the adult ego, and then the transpersonal phase, which was moving past the ego into these areas of sort of the reconnection with the world, the mystical, the spiritual. So this was just sort of a general model, but based on this model, he came up with one of the things that he is well known for, which is the pre-trans fallacy. He has modified this position uh, somewhat in recent work that we will talk about later. But the pre-trans fallacy said this. It said that regression to pre-personal states can be mistaken for evolution to transpersonal states. So somebody could be in a non-egoic state, but that didn't necessarily mean that they were actually sort of doing something that was bringing them forward. It could be something where they were regressing. So, for example, Wilber suggested that Freud mistook genuine mystical experiences, mystical states, as regression to infantile states. So, in other words, they were real transpersonal things. And because Freud did not have any room for that, he assumed that everything that was a non egoic state was a regression to an infantile state. So, um, that's kind of the opposite version of the pre-trans fallacy. Because, of course, um, pre-personal can be taken for transpersonal, and transpersonal can be taken for pre-personal. Wilber suggested that Jung made the opposite error, that is, mistaking pre-rational mythology as divine revelation. So, the pre-trans fallacy essentially wants to take non-egoic experiences and suggest that there is a very strong dividing line, that experiences are on a continuum. And here you see the first inkling of his notion of a very um, clearly established evolutionary line, so that states are either pre-personal, personal, or transpersonal, and there really isn't any sort of wiggle room. It's just like that's how they are. There is a clear distinction between pre-personal and transpersonal. In his third phase, Wilber 3, he was looking at this developmental process and realized that development might not be uniform on all in all dimensions of the personal development. So for example, let's say that you had just theoretically say 3 stages of development: stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. A person might be at stage 3 highly developed in their cognitive maturation. They might be less developed in their interpersonal, their relational skills. Maybe they're only in stage 2. In their psychosexual, maybe they're only in stage 1. Emotional, maybe also, less mature. Moral, maybe less mature. So maybe strong development in some areas, less in others. So here Wilber is making the distinction that even though he saw development to be a linear process, that not all aspects of the person necessarily followed that process at the same rate of speed. That you had to make account for the various um, parts actually following the process of evolution at their own speed. He suggested that one might be able to take the various aspects of the personality and measure how much where each one was on this developmental scale and make sort of a psychogram of the person's developmental status. This brings us to Wilber 4, one of the better known versions of Wilber's thought, which is the AQUAL model, the all quadrants, all levels. And this model begins with the assumption that the world is made of holons. Now, this comes out of systems theory. It's an adaptation of systems theory as proposed by Arthur Koestler, and suggesting that the cosmos is a holarchy, that is, a series of levels, so that any holon, is simultaneously a whole and a part. That is, it is a whole that consists of smaller parts, and it is a part of some larger whole. So, a holarchy then is a hierarchy of self-regulating holons that are subject to control by some larger whole. So, for example, we could say that the organs of my body are holons. They are they are a whole in and of themselves, but they're made of smaller parts that are themselves wholes in their own right. And the organs, even though they are whole in themselves, they are part of a larger organism, which is my body. And then I, as an individual, am part of a larger system, which is a community, and that community is part of a larger system, which is a society, and that society is part of a larger system, which is the world, and so on. So that each thing that we might look at and say, oh, that's a thing. That thing is made up of smaller parts, and it is itself a part in a larger whole. Right, so that's the beginning point in describing the world in this AQUAL model. Now, where Wilber goes then is he suggests that every holon at any level of that hierarchy is a phenomenon that occurs in 4 different quadrants. It occurs basically in an external form and an internal form. It occurs in a singular and in a plural. So that we have these 4 quadrants. The upper left is the interior individual. So that's the personal interior life, personal inner life. The upper right is the individual exterior life. So whereas the upper left has to do with my intentions, my motivations, my internal experience, the upper right has to do with my behavior. The lower left is the interior collective, which has to do with culture. That is, what is the inside version? What is that? What is it? How is it that people think and feel and intend and imagine um, as a cultural group? And then, of course, the lower right is exterior collective, which is how do people in a society act? What is the external collective? Now, one of the reasons that Wilber wanted to create this model with an interior and exterior is that he was trying to make a case for the, if you will, the intelligence of the world, the soulness of the world, because he was saying that every holon occurs in all 4 quadrants, so that everything that has an outside also has an inside. Everything that science reduces to, dead matter is in fact not dead matter, because science is just not looking at the left-hand quadrants. But if it exists in the right-hand quadrants, then Wilber would say it also exists in the left-hand quadrants. It has an inside. So the lamp, the table, the chair, the package on my desk, I see them as objects in the external world, but everything that exists in the right-hand quadrant also exists in the left-hand quadrant. That is, the lamp, the table, the desk, the chair, the package, all have an inside as well. All have an innerness to them. So that's really sort of one of the purposes of the assertion, him wanting to have these holons as existing in all 4 quadrants. Now, of course, where Wilber before had been talking about this developmental line, this personal evolutionary line, now with the 4 quadrants, what he did was open this up and say, hey, evolution doesn't just happen in the inner dimension, in inter-individual dimension, like we think of in spiritual development, and it doesn't just happen in the external collective as we think of in evolution. So what he did, he put the 4 quadrants and he put spiritual evolution in the upper left, biological evolution in the lower right, and then suggested that there was also evolution in these other 2 directions, in the lower left being cultural evolution and the upper right being sort of the individual organism, the evolution of the individual organism. So that's the Aqua model. That's one of the sort of basic, one of the most common and most well-known theories of Wilber. That is this idea that the world exists in 4 quadrants and evolution occurs in all 4 quadrants. In the integral post-metaphysical phase, Wilber 5, this is quite a shift for Wilber because this is sort of his attempt to get at the grand theory of everything. He changes several things. First of all, he rejects the objectivist worldview. So that is, he shifts to a more postmodern stance. And he also explicitly rejects perennialist metaphysics, in part because he had been criticized for um, being metaphysical. He also rejected his concept of the great chain of being, which we haven't gone into, but essentially the great chain of being is um, one idea that comes out of this model of evolution in all these various directions. So, what he did instead was suggest an integral theory. And in this integral theory, let's say that we could take all of the traditions of the world and we could somehow compare them all with each other. Then we'd be able to say, well, none of these traditions are objectively true, but every tradition has a piece of truth. And if we could just somehow assemble all of these pieces into a whole, then we would see what the whole is that these only partially reflect. And that's the aspiration of Wilber's integral post-metaphysical approach. So, um, essentially, if we could just take all of the traditions and we could see them through this integral lens, then together these traditions that all bring a partial truth would open the way to a truth that is beyond any of them. To just kind of to flesh this out a little bit, I'm going to read this quote from John Rowan, leading Wilber scholar. And he described Wilber's methodology in this way. He said, what he, Wilber, has done is to trawl through the world literature on levels of consciousness to discover what is common between them. His reasoning is simple. That which all or most agree on is common to them. From a number of independent sources, some based on personal experience, for that is relevant to mysticism, he built up a consistent story with some very well-established way stations. Now, it's a very inspiring vision. If it were just possible to see all of these various traditions and see what is it, how could we figure out what it is that they all have in common, then we could figure out what is really the secret behind all of the world's spiritual traditions, what the essence is of these many different cultures and paths. So, what an integral approach wants to do is to honor all traditions. What it claims to do is to honor all traditions. But notice that it also supersedes the authority of any path. So individual traditions are then seen as metaphysical systems about reality, and they are subject to the same kind of critiques that were leveled at Wilber in his Wilber 3. So that's because that's when he started to be criticized for being metaphysical. So what Wilber has done, he was being criticized for being metaphysical, and he's sort of taking this and turning around and saying, no, 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 no. These traditions are metaphysical. But by putting them all together, I can get beyond them to something that is not metaphysical, to something that is actually real. And in this way, when the traditions have sort of been shown to be defective, the only thing that remains safe from the critique of being metaphysical and safe from the deficiencies of the traditions is Wilber's Aqua model. So follow me here. The aqual model then becomes the non-metaphysical metaphysic that breathes life into the spiritual traditions of the world. So essentially, Wilber is saying, if we could just take all of these partial truths and put them together, juxtapose them with each other, we'd be able to find the real truth that is behind them. And then, even though all of these systems are partial, defective, metaphysical, we will now know what the truth is that is behind them. So we will actually have an authoritative knowledge of what it is that these traditions were imperfectly trying to reflect. So it's a very ambitious undertaking, and Wilber is still in the development of that set of ideas. He has made a change on his notion that pre-personal states, that children cannot have transpersonal experiences, for example, by agreeing that any state of spiritual realization can occur at any stage of development. And what has been developed is the Wilber-Combs lattice, which suggests that over the lifetime, a person going through various stages of maturation might have a variety of spiritual. Uh, 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 Somebody going through various stages of development might have any number of different states of experience. So somebody who was at a high, um, sort of highly developed stage could still have a sort of much less evolved state of consciousness. Or somebody who was at a lower level of development could have a very advanced transpersonal state. So this is kind of a deviation that Wilber has made from his more structured hierarchical model. He's saying, well, no, it actually people can have various levels of experience, irregardless of their stage of development. So just bringing you up to date on one of the more recent developments in Wilber's thought. So that brings us to the end of the overview of Wilber's models. There's much more we could go into, but that is um, that is a summary. Essentially, Wilber is trying to have a foundational theory that includes the inner dimension of experience and that includes spiritual evolution. Now we're going to move on to some of the critiques of Wilber. And one of those is that um, he tends to shift his position very rapidly so that when somebody criticizes him, he says, well, clearly you haven't read my work because I've already moved past that, which makes it, he's kind of like a moving target. And it can be difficult to critique him because um, he or the people who are very loyal followers of his will, to pretty much any critique say, well, he's not there anymore. So I kind of like to think of him as the man whose current thinking is never wrong. Some of the difficulties that people have pointed out, or the challenges people have pointed out, is that Wilber tends to reject his critics as being misinformed, of misunderstanding his writing, or of critiquing an earlier version of his work. He tends to ridicule an idea and then later incorporate it, sometimes with very minimal credit to the source. In fact, he rarely acknowledges the sources of his ideas, at least not in any substantive way. He will sometimes just give a glancing credit rather than really giving credit where credit is due. Another interesting criticism is that he has actively suppressed dissenting opinions. It's kind of an interesting story behind this. Miles Vick, who was editor of the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology from 1976 to 1999, had a relationship with Ken Wilber. And any article that sort of addressed Wilber's work or was relevant for Wilber's thought, Miles Vick would send it to Wilber and ask him to review it and to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Now, the motivation probably was that when Miles Vick took over the journal in 1976, the field was still very young, and Wilber was the thought leader. And as a young and vulnerable field, it would be easy to see how somebody might say, well, this guy is really smart. He's kind of our intellectual leader. We want to be able to allow our field to grow and we safely without being, diluted or criticized too much. So let me just send the articles to this guy and have him look at them. And if he doesn't think that it should be published, then we won't publish it. The downside is that Wilber, as one scholar, essentially held veto power over the scholarly discussion. Now, I remember hearing in the 80s and 90s that it was very, very difficult to get anything published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, that they were very critical, very choosy. And of course, now we know what that was about. I know of 3 different scholars who submitted papers repeatedly to the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, were never able to get a single paper published. And of course, uh, this then one of those was Michael Washburn, an excellent transpersonal theorist, wrote a book, The Ego and the Dynamic Ground, a transpersonal theory of human development. A very fine book I would recommend if anybody is interested in that. And so the way this came out was that when Kaisa Puhaka took over editorial control in the year 2000, Wilber heard that Jorge Ferrer, who of course is developing the participatory model, heard that his critique of perennialism was scheduled to be published in her first issue, and he asked her to extend the same courtesy to him that Miles Vick, the previous editor, had done, and to not publish this piece of Ferrer's. Of course, she said, this is a scholarly journal. We don't do that. A scholarly journal is for a variety of ideas to be published, and so I'm not going to do that. Interestingly enough, the very next day, Wilber sent a letter to the European Transpersonal Association announcing that transpersonal psychology was dead, that the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology had become ideological, and that integral was now the future of the movement. Another critique of Wilber's work is he claims that it is aperspectival. He claims that by putting all of these traditions together and examining them for what they have in common, that it no longer reflects a situated viewpoint, that it no longer has a sort of a subjective location, if you will. If we were to use the language of feminist critique, you would say that he is suggesting that because his work draws on many locations, it really has no location of its own, that it is beyond location. Okay. problem with this is that even if you are taking things from many different cultures and you're sort of synthesizing, you're drawing them together, you're seeing what they have in common, and so on and so forth, you're still doing that process from a particular cultural and intellectual location. And what that location is going to have an effect on the results. You can have the same set of points and you can connect them all with lines, but where your starting point is for drawing those lines will change what the synthesis look like. That's just a sort of a simple metaphor for the fact that from a postmodern or feminist point of view, everyone has location, even someone who is synthesizing many other points of view. So we're going to look for a moment at the notion of um, metaphysics that Wilber is trying to say that he is post-metaphysical. So what is he saying when he's post-metaphysical? Why is it that people critiqued Wilber for being metaphysical? And why is he now saying that he is able to get past that? So metaphysics, um, usually people think of metaphysics, oh, that's beyond the physical. Well, that's not really in the sort of the European um, history of philosophy. The term metaphysical has a very specific meaning. Okay, Aristotle, who was sort of the authority in philosophy in the Middle Ages, had wrote 8 books, or at least what we have is 8 books of his that are about the physical world. And in the medieval period, these were called physics. This set of books was called physics. And these were given to students to read first because they were considered more simple, more approachable. Then there are another 14 of Aristotle's writings that have survived that are to be read after physics or metaphysics. So it simply refers to the fact that refers to the area of study represented by these 14 books that you should read after physics. What is that area of study? It is first philosophy, first science, wisdom, and theology. And more than anything, it is starting points. So you could start your inquiry from many different places. But what is the right starting place? What is the true starting place? That is what Aristotle was trying to determine, what he was trying to discover in those 14 books. What's the one and true starting point? Now, of course, from the reason that this is important is that depending on your starting point, you're going to end up at a different place. So if you, for example, assume that the world is made of little dead particles arranged in remarkable ways and, sort of rule-following particles, you can discover many things about the world. But the world that you discover will be a world made of rule-following particles. If you begin with the assumption that the world is made of interconnected, interrelated presences, you will end up in a very different place. You will discover other things about the world. The world will look very different than it did if you were having a more materialist, reductionist assumption. So, starting point is important because where you start um, changes the nature of the world that you will discover. Now, relative to this, postmodernism says, hey, you know what? There is no one right starting point. There are many different starting points, and they will get you to different places. And that's just the way it is. So, feminism, for example, would say that each one of us has a location. That your location is where you start from, your gender, your culture, your history, your beliefs, and that everyone has unique location. So let's just use this idea of location. And let's say that there are a variety of different locations, cultural, intellectual locations, sort of where different spiritual traditions might sit, for example. Now, let's say that one scholar comes along and says, you know what? I am going to study all of these. I am going to synthesize them. That scholar still has a location. That scholar is still on the map. And where that scholar's own cultural and intellectual location is will affect how the synthesis is done and what things are seen as important. What Wilber is claiming is that in fact he does not have a specific location, that he is beyond location and is not limited because he is looking at all these different traditions and trying to hold them all together, that he is not limited in the way that those traditions are. So this is his idea of post-metaphysical, not limited by location, has transcended the limitation of location by studying all of these traditions and taking them all together. It's a little bit like a detective novel where there are many clues and a hidden truth. And if you can if you can follow the clues, if you can weave them together in the right way, you will arrive at the hidden truth. You will discover who murdered the dinner guest. Okay, so that's an analogy for Wilber's approach. Now, of course, I would say that even the integral scholar has a location, that the act of engaging with different traditions and doing this synthesis process is still going to be affected by your own assumptions, by your own determination of what is more important and how it is that you approach and sort. Now, interestingly, if we take just this little drawing that we've got here, we can look at these various pieces and we can see that what Wilber is suggesting is that each one of these pieces, if you could take them all together, they're all fractional. If you add them up, you arrive at the one. But what if they can't be added? What if they in fact are not fractional in the sense that you can join them together and come up with a cohesive whole? Let me explain what I mean by that. I'm going to do a little bit of comparison between ancient Greek thought and ancient Hebrew thought. So, ancient Greeks looked at the world as hierarchical and as having different levels of um, existence. So, at the highest level, you had the Dome of Stars. The Dome of Stars was sort of like beyond the human realm, sort of that archetypal divine realm. Below that, you had the level of fire. Now, fire was up from earth. And that is why if you light a fire, that the flames go upward and the smoke ascends, because fire is attempting to return to its own domain. Below fire, you had air. Below air, you have earth and water. Um, Rather, water and earth, actually, but in this chart, the water sign is a little bit lower because it's pointing to the water that kind of rings around the earth. So if you hold up a stone and you drop it, you let go of it, it drops because it is Earth trying to return to its natural location. If you drop a stone in water, it will go down through the water because the natural level of water is higher than Earth. Right? So this is the model. There's a there's a physical structure. Greeks wanted to know, how is that put together? What's the shape of that? What is the architecture of that? What is the what are the physical dimensions of that? That was their way of examining the universe. Those were the kinds of questions that they asked. Now, if you come to the ancient Hebrews, not so much interested in the shape of the world, much more focused on the structure of relationship, and especially the relationship between humans and the divine. And what they wanted was not an understanding of the shape and architecture of the cosmos, but conversation, dialogue, communion with the divine. Now, what came out of this was kind of an interesting thing, because when Hebrew poetry was read by the Greek church fathers, its imagery was taken as a divinely inspired account of cosmology. Why? Because those were the questions that the Greek church fathers were used to asking. What is the shape of the cosmos? So when they took these metaphors of Hebrew poetry, they took them to be divinely inspired information about the shape of the cosmos, even though in the Hebrew culture in which they were written, they were not intended that way at all. What this did was to perpetuate a very unusual cosmology in medieval Christian Europe, so that they believed that angels came with great barrels and opened the windows of heaven and poured the water from these barrels down through those windows, and this created rain. That's just one example, because there is a Hebrew uh, there's a passage in Hebrew scripture, a poetic passage, which talks about the windows of heaven being opened, when rain was about to come. So there's uh, an interesting tension, because many Christians think that because the Torah is in the Bible and because Jesus was Jewish, that their heritage is Judeo-Christian, that they're actually sort of, that they understand what Judaism is about, and that Christianity is sort of an extension of Judaism. And this is not the case. Judaism is a very different sort of tradition than Christianity, because Christianity was strongly shaped by these Hellenistic views, these views, this lens that the Greek church fathers brought to um, the study of Torah and other aspects of Hebrew scripture. So, in this way, Judaism and Christianity have what you could say very different locations, metaphysically speaking. They ask very different questions of the world. The lens is not the same, so that you cannot just sort of take the two and add them together and get something that makes sense. When you take Hebrew poetry and you put it together with the Greek quest for divine information about how the cosmos is constructed, you you got this sort of really uh, illogical, fantastical medieval cosmology, where the sun actually rode in a chariot across the sky because Hebrew scripture says so, um, or any number of other poetical expressions that were taken to be, um, if they're in the Bible, well, okay, they have to be divinely inspired, taken as literal structural representations. So you put those two things together. This is an example of how you can take two things that sit on very different sets of assumptions, that see things through very different lenses. You try to add them together, and you get something that doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? In the same way that if you have two fractions that have different denominators, you can't just add them. You have to find some way of getting them to speak the same language or have the same denominator, if you will, before you have the ability to add them together and get something meaningful. So, because each system, each of one of these different spiritual traditions sits in a different location, metaphysically, just in the same way that Judaism and Christianity sit in very different locations. If you are going to try to add them, it's a very active process. It's a process of construction. And where you construct from will be from your own metaphysical location. What your cultural background is, what the things are that you've studied, how it is that you've put them together, that's going to influence, that's going to shape the way that you pull things from all these different traditions and make this grand synthesis. And of course, if we rearrange these a little bit, it's not very far from the perennial philosophy, which is where Wilber started. Now, okay, so this little illustration isn't entirely fair because it's just a metaphor. But I, when I look at Wilber's post-metaphysical, um, it is not post-metaphysical and it is perennialist. It is not post-metaphysical because to take metaphysical systems and say that they tell you something about an objectively true hidden dimension is still a metaphysical proposition because it's still talking about a hidden dimension that is defining that is the cause of how things are in the world. And that's sort of the essence of metaphysics. Just by comparison, you can see that um, certainly in the way that I drew it, there's a similarity. Um, that's not enough. That's, like I say, that's not an entirely fair way to compare it. But I'd say I think that perennialism is still the essential philosophy behind Wilber's work. Um, Perennialism, of course, still works for many people, and I would say that there's a way in which that I find it a helpful paradigm too. It's just that if you put it into a scholarly context, it really doesn't hold water. Uh, that's really the the difficulties. If you're working in transpersonal studies, transpersonal psychology, you need something that's going to stand up to scrutiny in a scholarly world. So, we can summarize problems with Wilber's non-dual model. First of all, it doesn't permit any diversity of phenomenology. That is, um, what Wilber has suggested is not only is the non-dual the ultimate out of which everything arises, but that all traditions are actually seeking a non-dual experience, so that the highest state in any tradition is actually the same. If you get to the highest state through Buddhism, through Hinduism, through Christianity, through Judaism, through Taoism, you're going to end up in the same place. You're going to be having phenomenologically the same experience. Doesn't really seem to be true in studies of comparative mysticism, um, and it suggests that there can be no diversity. So that's one of the limitations. Another one is that it imposes an arbitrary conceptual framework on phenomenological experience that claims to supersede traditional interpretation. So essentially, integral post-metaphysical comes and says, you Buddhists there, you think that what you're doing is this, but we know that what you're doing is actually that. So it actually suggests that a 21st century person can come to these traditions that have existed for thousands of years, put them all together, come up with their essence, then come back to the traditions themselves and tell them that they are wrong about their interpretations because this exercise has been done. At the same time that it is imposing this framework on these spiritual traditions, it is denying that it is imposing a framework. It is saying, no, no, we're not imposing a framework. We've actually discovered the actual transcendent ultimate truth. And so we're comparing you with that, and we're telling you that you're not meeting up. So that's not imposing a framework. That's just telling you that you're wrong. So that is a bit of a problem, certainly from a postmodern perspective, because it does claim really to have identified ultimate truth. Another point is that it discounts the integral metaphysical approach, discounts contradictory data as evidence of faulty interpretation. That is, the interpreters are not using Wilber's frame. So if you come up with different results, that's because you're not interpreting correctly. Little bit of a problem with that. Also, an oversimplification of non-duality creates opportunity for the inflation of simple intuitive states with advanced spiritual states. What does that mean? It means that if you sort of uncritically define the ultimate state as non-dual, what in fact has happened is that people are taking simple, intuitive, embodied states and claiming that these are non-dual states, that they are high-level enlightened states, when in fact they're not. Um, you do not just sort of drop into your body and have that sort of embodied intuitive experience, and from that make the assumption that you have achieved what may have taken, you know, a practitioner of another tradition decades or an entire lifetime to achieve. Um, so that is also problematic. At the same time, what Wilber has done is he has taken the notion of a perennial philosophy and he has explored it to a greater extent than anyone has ever done before. And if it were going to work, he would probably be the guy who would have made it work. Personally, I don't think that it does, except just kind of a general sort of way, non-specifically, to acknowledge that there is something shared in human spirituality, regardless of what tradition that you come from. Um, so that is Wilber's model. Those are some of the critiques.